Welcome everyone to my third interview. As you know, that my first two interviews were with a GC from India and South Africa. Today, I will be speaking with Brianne Kirkpatrick. If not many of you are aware of her, she is a genetic counseling counselor from Virginia, United States. She is a DNA coach. She's an author of a very interesting book, which also we will get to know during the interview. And she is the founder of WATERSHED DNA. You can visit her website to know more about WATERSHED DNA, but she will also shed some light during the interview. Unlike many genetic counselors, this interview is going to be very unique and going to be something very different because she's not exactly from a medical genetic counseling, but she's still in a very specialized and a very unique area of genetic counseling. Over to you, Brianne. Just if you could maybe let us know a little about your journey to becoming a genetic counselor and how you've come forward to becoming a founder and a president of WATERSHED DNA.
Sure, thank you. I'm glad that you're having me today, Disha, because this is a question that I get asked a lot, even by other genetic counselors. They're wondering, how did you get into this very specialized area of doing what you're doing? And it's kind of a lengthy story, so I try to shorten it up. I have a background in medical genetic counseling, and I did that for quite a number of years, both in the clinic and in research setting. And then as an interest in my own family history, I have a grandmother who was adopted and raised by her maternal grandparents. I got interested in ancestry testing for my own family's purposes, just to explore, are there more branches of the family tree that we aren't aware of? And in my course of getting involved in, it's called genetic genealogy, where you're using traditional genealogy, but also the DNA testing in combination to explore family history, I started to see all of these situations in other families that really needed the expertise of a genetic counselor, because there wasn't really anyone thinking about maybe the ethical implications, the social implications within a family, the communication difficulties that arise when surprise DNA results pop up. And so I began to realize that this was an area that could incorporate my professional background as well as my personal interest in genealogy and family history. And decided in 2015 that I was going to start a private practice in this area to be able to work with clients one-on-one that were having questions, and launched WATERSHED DNA in 2016, so the beginning of 2016. And it was a challenging transition because there wasn't anybody else doing this that I could really follow the path of. But what I realized being a genetic counselor is there's always a first person to do something in every area. There was a first cancer specialized genetic counselor. There was a first cardiovascular specialized genetic counselor. So setting a new path and starting something new is not new to genetic counseling. Every city has its first genetic counselor. Every country has its first. So genetic counselors, as it's part of who we are as such a young profession, relative to all other professions in our area, that someone's going to be the first. And so that part of it, I was okay with the uncertainty, and I don't know that everybody has that same being okay with uncertainty and not really knowing how things were going to turn out.
Yeah.
But that's a kind of a long-winded version of how it came to be that WATERSHED DNA existed. And it started originally as a website in my private one-on-one practice. And since then, I've kind of expanded it. I published a book called The DNA Guide for Adoptees. I published that with a friend of mine who's a genealogist, Shannon Combs Bennett. And that was the first of many planned books. I have a lot that I would like to write about.
Yeah.
Right now, it's the time limitation. I wanted to be able to reach people where they are. So a lot of people turn to the internet to search for support and information. So I started a blog on my website, and I started other resources. I started an online forum and support group for people that just needed someone to talk to, and not necessarily a counselor. Not everybody wants to work one-to-one with a counselor or has the resources to, or maybe they want to do both in combination, work with a counselor and be a part of a support group. So it's changed over the years, expanded. I'd love to see that continue. And I would love to see other genetic counselors start to apply their skills in this area. I think there's a need for it, and I think it could happen. It's just who else, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That is very interesting. And like I was telling or discussing with you initially, that not many people know about ancestry testing or genealogy as an expertise area of genetic counseling. So for students like me, when we think about getting into genetic counseling, we know that there are some known areas of genetic counseling in which you can get a job. So I'd like to understand, how does genealogy or ancestry genetic counselor, how does that come into picture when you think of moving ahead of maybe, the time of graduating from a genetic counseling university? So you've graduated and you're out there, and maybe you think of this as a profession. So how do you progress towards this as your expertise?
So genetic counseling programs tend to have similar curriculums. There's kind of a core curriculum that all of the programs are following, but there's variability from one program to another. And there are some programs that I've spoken with their students. I've given lectures. And so there might be programs that have a little bit more of a training opportunity in direct-to-consumer testing. I don't think that ancestry testing specifically will be a focus, and I actually don't know that programs have the capacity to kind of expand beyond the curriculum they already have.
Yep.
And so my encouragement is somebody who is interested in this particular intersection of two niches, genealogy and genetic counseling, maybe look at it as your genetic counseling program is a foundation. And anything you do before that program or after that program could be focused on the special interests that you have. So I did not know that I was going to get into genealogy. It wasn't a grand plan. It just kind of happened. And it was something that I went with the flow of the way my life went. And it happened for me that it all happened around the same time that the direct-to-consumer companies were exploding in popularity. Their tests were becoming very popular. So it was, some of it was planned and some of it was just responding to the needs that were present. And I think that's an important mindset to have if you want to apply to genetic counseling programs. You might have an idea for what you want to do, and then life might have a different idea for you. So be open to the possibility that your vision may not become the vision that happens in your life, and that's okay. When one door closes, another door opens. I'm a really strong believer in that.
Yeah.
I think it's important attitude to have going into even the application process.
Yeah. That's so well said, when with the fact that you plan something for your life, but then it can so happen that your life can take you into a different direction, which might be even better than what you've planned. I think that does apply to a lot of students like us as well, because I think I initially had a dream of, becoming a researcher or a scientist. And I did end up spending a lot doing my master's in biomedical sciences in the UK. But I realized I wasn't a person who wanted to be behind the laboratory doing test tube experiments, and I was missing the human connection and the human touch. And now I am here trying to apply for genetic counseling, and I think this field has definitely got a spark in me where I know that it is going to give me both the, the communication part of dealing with patients or clients and being more of a people's person, but using the knowledge of genetics. So I guess it practically makes a lot of sense that, yeah, you just have to be prepared for whatever comes forward. Well, moving on, now that we've got to know a bit about how this can be an expertise field in genetic counseling. So as you said, it's more about direct to consumer testing. Could you tell our audience a bit about what is NPE and how has it turned out to be a sudden booming or an emerging field in genetic testing?
Good question. So NPE is an acronym that has been used in the literature for a long time, and it originally was an acronym that stood for non-paternity event. So a way to describe discovery that somebody's father is not biologically their father. And there are other terms that some people use for this. Misattributed parentage is a common one. And now NPE is, that acronym has evolved in recent years to mean not parent expected, because that's more inclusive of all of the situations that can come into play. So someone who is conceived from egg donation, for example, could do a direct-to-consumer test. They opt into the family matching portion of their ancestry test and realize that they're not matching to family that they recognize. Names are not familiar. They're maybe having matches with close relatives that are strangers to them. So the NPE discovery is not new, but it's happening a lot more often now because people can access the DNA testing on their own via the at-home test or the direct-to-consumer test. So NPE, the support for NPE discoveries was a little bit slow to come. That was back in 2016 when I started Watershed DNA. There were no support groups. It wasn't really a recognized phenomenon happening that often. I knew it was happening because people were coming to me with these discoveries. And so I started a Facebook support group for them. Now there are multiple Facebook support groups for people that make these discoveries. The companies are starting to acknowledge that it's happening by posting pages on their website that are links to support resources for people that get an NPE discovery. So it's a lot different now in 2020 than it was even 4 years ago, which is great. I'm happy to be a part of it and to see it growing.
Yeah, I think now it's more for a common public point of view. I think the way NPE comes into picture is that it's done as a fun activity where a child might end up giving a gift of ancestry testing or DNA testing to their parents, and that's how it then goes through the entire process and they realize that they've turned out to be an NPE. So yeah, it's quite interesting how it's emerging into a completely new area, and how it's getting so much information out here, which we probably weren't aware of before. Now I'd just like to know, so we know what NPE is and how the DNA testing or genetic testing of NPE happens, but how does your role as a genetic counselor fit into NPE, or what exactly is it that you do as a genetic counselor as a part of Watershed DNA? What your role is like?
So I view my role as a triager. So I get emails from all over the world and the country, and people that will explain to me this discovery that they made and they don't know where to go next. And for many, so I've gotten to the point that I can tell this person is very new in their journey. They're in the shock stage and the doubt stage, which is very common and makes sense. It's normal. It's part of the process of making that discovery. They have a different set of needs than somebody who has known their discovery for a year and has had a different time, a different way to process that. And, maybe at this point, their question is, I'm ready to share this news with my sister that we're not full sisters, we're half sisters. How do I do that? So I often send people to counselors or therapists that I know have the expertise to work in this area. There are not very many of them, but the ones that are kind of specialized in this area, I know of them and can kind of get people that way. Other people need to be kind of pushed towards a support group or a particular blog post or a particular book. And so much of what I'm doing now, and it's one of the reasons that my website's very different now than it was when it first began, was I'm trying to triage people to the place where they need to be. Because obviously I'm one person, I can't individually help every single person who needs the help.
Yeah.
And so how do I use my skills as communicator? I know the resources in this area. I think that's something that genetic counselors get really good at, is knowing the resources in their area and how to navigate through them. So, and then also the bioethics training that I had, both in grad school and in my undergraduate training. I did some bioethics coursework, just realizing the significance of this discovery, not just on the person, but on the whole family unit, and being able to be a good judge of, where's there's an ethical fine line that pops up very often. So how do you walk that fine line? How do you, if there's a family involved, who is your patient or who is your client?
Yeah.
And how do you focus on that? But also recognize that there's a family around that needs support. So it's not an easy job at all. But I don't think anybody who goes into genetic counseling as a profession expects that their job is going to be easy. It's not. It's hard. It's hard to get into grad school. It's hard to complete grad school. It's hard to pass the board exams. It's hard to keep your continuing education up. I mean, all of those are hard. So nobody goes into genetic counseling and makes it through with the expectation that's going to be easy.
Yeah.
And I think that's a draw to a lot of people, because it's never boring.
Yes.
Some days I wish it were a little bit more boring, but then I think, no, I wouldn't.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I think the main reason students like us want to get into genetic counseling is because we've learned it's not monotonous. We've learned it's as equal as having a profession, where you are called as maybe a licensed doctor or a licensed surgeon. It's not a cakewalk for sure. And it's a profession entirely in itself, which is growing and which is badly needed in science and in genetics. It's helping to, like you said, it's more like a triaging role, and it's more of a mediator role, I feel, where you're able to communicate complex information to a patient or a client, and not necessarily patient as well. Like, I think the term patient is very situation basis, because a lot of times they might not be a patient, they might not have an illness, but they're just a client. So yeah, I think we wouldn't want it to be boring for sure.
Yes.
Okay. So that's quite interesting to know what you actually do as a genetic counselor in NPE. But this comes as, like I said, this comes as something very new to, I think, most of us, and any of them who will be listening to this later as well. So how do you describe, or how would you express your identity from, a medical genetic counselor to something into like an DTC genetic counselor or ANCESTRY genetic counselor? How would you differentiate that?
It's something that is still an ongoing process for me. And I've been through times of struggle where, my identity as a genetic counselor has come into question. And am I still a genetic counselor if I'm doing the work that I'm doing? And I'm not in a hospital or clinic setting. I'm not always working with the medical genetics topic. It still does come up with some of my clients.
Mhm.
And I'm still licensed and certified in medical, genetic counseling, and the training is all medical based. So that's still part of my identity. But now that I'm doing something that doesn't fit under the classic definition of genetic counseling, am I still a genetic counselor? And it's something that I've struggled with, but I've always come back to the place that my foundation and my core and my professional training and my titles and my licenses, I am a genetic counselor. I'm just doing something different.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is a very simple answer, because I think you can't have a detailed answer for that, because it is, yeah, like you said, it's so simple to understand that it's just a new branch, it's a new area, and it's just something different. And yeah, it's hard to kind of accept something different when it initially comes to you. Like you said, something new is always uncertain, and um, in the initial part of it, not many people can deal with it or accept it as a fact. But yeah, it comes slowly to you. And I definitely can already see why this can be a very passionating field in genetic counseling, because it's not very medical, but it's still more of crisis support, I guess, if you say, or more like counseling someone who's into deep crisis and deep emotional disturbance level. So yeah.
I would. Yeah, I would describe it as like crisis counseling, and because I'm not trained as a therapist to work with someone over an extended period of time to help
Yeah.
them work through that grief process, but I can recognize it when I see it,
Yeah.
and know that this person is in the midst of a grief process, and they don't recognize it because you wouldn't. This is out of left field for a lot of people, and yeah, but it's still at the core. My genetic counseling skills come up all of the time. It is still genetic counseling. And the way that I describe genetic counselors now is much more succinct than in the past. I say that genetic counselors help people understand DNA.
Yeah.
That's at the core. Whether you're a professor helping run a genetic counseling program, but you're a genetic counselor, you are helping your students understand DNA so that they can help others understand DNA.
Yeah.
If you're working in a laboratory as a lab genetic counselor and you're on the phone with customers that are calling in, or medical professionals, you are helping them understand DNA in a very different way, still the same.
Yeah.
So that's the way that I've figured out works in describing genetic counselors, that I'm still included. Because a lot of definitions, the definition written into the law in many of the states in the United States is not what I do. So, by law, am I a genetic counselor in those states? I don't know.
I guess that will become more clear in the future, maybe, as more and more genetic counselors emerge in this branch as a GC, I guess. Yeah, it's something to see as to how this progresses in future.
Yeah.
Okay, well, now that you were talking about, the skills that you do use in this branch of genetic counseling, that got me to asking you a very curious question that most of us usually ask the other genetic counselors as well, that what are the, like the different psychosocial tools of communication that you use when you are talking to your clients or your patients?
It's a good question. It's hard to, I think when you are so familiar with doing your own work, having to describe the tools that I use. I know I use tools. So there's a lot of, so first of all, there's the textbooks, the websites, and the knowledge base. So really understanding how DNA is transmitted from one generation to the next is a very specific skill set. And there are tools that I use to analyze genetic relationships. There's a website called DNA Painter that has tools and information on it.
Mm-hmm.
There are training courses that I've been through in the genealogy field that have equipped me with kind of the holes that my genetic counseling background did not fill in.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess I pull on, so I guess that's training and skills. That's not necessarily tools.
Yeah.
Could you be a little more specific? Because I think I don't.
Yeah, I think in terms of tools, I think we're trying to understand the psychological communication tools that you would use in your communication or interaction when a patient comes to you. And let's say, obviously, like you said, most of them that come are lost. They do not know where to go from here with the results in their hand. And most of them are definitely in a state of shock and disturbed. So what are the skills of communication in specific that you probably get to use a lot when you speak to patients like these?
Got it. Yeah, okay, I can answer that. That makes sense. So listening is a huge skill and tool that if you listen to someone tell their story, you can begin to pick out where they are along the understanding, and then asking appropriate follow-up questions. So maybe it seems like they've realized that the DNA test is indicating their father's not their biological father, but I need to know now who else they've told. Do they have any support? Have they told their spouse? Have they told a friend? Have they confronted their mother? Because that conversation can have very different outcomes. So listening, asking the appropriate follow-up questions, and then being able to validate their feelings for where they are. Make sure they know they're not alone, because they're not. Make sure they know that what they're feeling is normal, and make sure that they know it will get better. It can get better. It will get better. And it can't be rushed. It's not a process that can be rushed. So I'd say listening, appropriate follow-up questions, knowing the next step for people, no matter where they are in the process, and being able to communicate that with compassion and empathy. That is not I've realized that's not a skill everybody has. And so I really try to pull on that a lot, because that's what people need. They don't.
That's so right. And I think definitely what really stands out when I speak to you is the skills that we hear from all the genetic counselors is the same pretty much. But I think the deepness of the skill that you would use in NPE would be slightly more extreme and different compared to maybe the medical genetic counseling side, because yours looks more of a psychological aspect of dealing with the results of an NPE. So listening does stand out to me in the ones that you've described so far.
I think that developing self-awareness and working with a counselor by yourself, like as I didn't do that until after graduate school.
Yeah.
And I think it would have helped even more if during graduate school I had been working with a counselor for myself, because that was a very hard and stressful time in my life. And eventually it did come that I had my own counseling experience after a very stressful situation that came up in my life. And it allowed me to develop that awareness in myself that helps me recognize it in other people. So if there's something that I would want listeners to take away from it is to realize even counselors need counselors, even doctors need doctors, even dentists need dentists. So the more work you can do on yourself is only going to help you be a better whatever it is you are. So if you want to be a great genetic counselor, make sure you've done the work to in your own self, your own life. It really helps. I think that's a really key piece of what's made a difference for me in the work that I do.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that bit of important information as a takeaway for every one of us. I think just one very interesting another question about NPE that we are reading a lot on articles quite recently is the debate about the thoughts on direct-to-consumer testing. And a lot of times we hear about, the companies like 23andMe, especially. I think that's been one big highlight in most of the articles that we read. 23andMe comes up. And I think the point behind it is that how accurate or how true are these direct-to-consumer testings or these ancestry testings that you do? Like, how do they maintain the ethnicity and the trueness behind the results? Because I think a lot of times mix-ups do happen, and a lot of times the results come out something which turns out to not be exactly true as well in a few cases. So what are your thoughts about that?
So as for accuracy of the testing, so the family matching algorithms are accurate, but there can be errors in the way a relationship is described. So for example, first cousins and half siblings can share approximately the same amount of DNA. And I've seen situations where 23andMe has falsely called a relationship a half sibling relationship when it was actually first cousins, and vice versa. This happens at 23andMe, but not at the other companies because they don't get that specific with relationships. So Ancestry DNA, for example, will report a level of relationship. So close family, immediate family, second to third cousin. So it's more general and there's more room for, wiggle room. So in terms of accuracy, it depends on what you're looking at and which company is reporting it. The ethnicity pie chart where someone has their percentages of what part of the world their ancestors came from, that also, I tell people to take that with a grain of salt because it differs from one company to the next and even over time because the reference database is changing. So, but don't use that as an excuse to ignore your result if it's showing that you're 50% Ashkenazi Jewish and neither of your parents is Jewish. There's something up there. So that's not something to just brush off as the company was wrong. I ended up writing a really short ebook to address this question of could the results be wrong. And I go through and outline all of the different reasons that it can seem wrong or be wrong to help people essentially rule all of those out before they can accept that it's an NPE finding that's going on for them. Because there is a lot of doubt, and that's the first question that people come to me with. Is there any way this could be wrong? So
interesting. So, because most of the NPE clients that come to you come with the result. So a doubt that popped up in my head was, do they get to actually see a genetic counselor even before going to the testing? Do they get any sort of counseling before the testing?
No, not direct to consumer tests. Now things are changing, and some of the companies are involving genetic counselor networks as part of their medical DTC test path. And so for Ancestry DNA, if you're going to opt into their medical reports, There's a different path you have to follow to get approval by a medical provider before the test can be ordered. And then when your results come back, they have a process for automatically getting you connected with a telephone or video chat genetic counselor. So things are changing, and it's different. There's not, it's not all the same depending on where you're having your testing done.
Yeah.
But no, there's not any formal pre-test genetic counseling like you would get in many cases if you go through the medical system for a medical genetic test.
Yeah. So would you say, or would you think it would be a good thing to come in the future? Because, you know, a lot of these NP clients, once they get the testing done, even as a fun activity, they do end up in a grief and an area of shock for quite a longer time. And it pretty much looks like it's devastating, and, you know, their entire life looks to them as if it's changed all of a sudden. So do you think it might be a good thing to look for in the future to get genetic counseling or brief counseling before you get the testing done, so that the client is prepared of what can be expected? Or does it already happen when they go for the testing? Do they get to know what they can expect, or that it can be unexpected?
In an ideal world, everybody would have access to a genetic counselor and genetic counseling before they have any DNA test. Because we think of all of the potential ramifications, everything that could happen, and we want people to be aware. But in reality, it doesn't happen. And I think there could be changes to the way informed consent is obtained by the testing companies before they, before someone has tests. But whether that looks like meeting face-to-face or individually, you know, with a genetic counselor, I'm not convinced that's either doable or ideal, I guess. I think it's important to have a safety net for people who need it. And it's like if someone, so I think about, say I were to be sent for an MRI and they were suspecting, you know, I had a mass in my abdomen, but instead they find cancer in my lungs. They find something in my lungs. They don't say, well, I'm sorry, that's not, we were looking for this other thing and we didn't find it, so we can't help you. If you find something else, your responsibility is to help that patient to get to where they need to be. And the companies have slowly come around to this, which is good. But I think greater awareness that these discoveries are happening, and rather trying to prevent people from having testing, to prevent them from discovering something surprising, instead of trying to put up any roadblocks before the testing, is to create a better safety net after the results come.
Definitely. I think there is something very similar for, I don't know whether it's for NP or for a different type of genetic testing, but usually the informed consent on, I think, the first page or on the first half page does mention a statement related to expecting unanticipated results or something like that. So yeah, maybe a small statement of that sort in DTC testing, because it's direct to consumer and there's not much scope for meeting a counselor or a doctor, or for that matter, any professional. Maybe it can be as an add-on in an informed consent, so that at least they know that they've read it and they've signed it, and they at least have maybe somewhere an idea registered that anything can come out of the test.
I've had a number of clients say they noticed that. They saw that in the informed consent. They had to click an extra box acknowledging that they recognized they could get unexpected results, but they laughed it off because they didn't think it would apply to them. You know, that's
Yeah.
something that happens to other people, not, you know, that's, people never think it's going to happen to them.
Yeah.
And so I think it's there in the informed consent. And the piece that's missing right now is that even during the informed consent process, there's an awareness of, if this happens to you, we will help you through it, and we will help you get connected to support.
Yep, that's a brilliant idea. Yeah.
I think I don't know that if that would be the solution, but it might be an added level of, at least when someone gets a surprise, they might remember, I had to check that box that said, if I get surprised, they're going to help me. So let me, get back to the company, how they're going to help me now that I've gotten my shot.
Yeah. I think the only thing stopping from getting that extra bit of information would be the fact that after the testing, not many companies do take the second step or the second process of, helping someone who wants to get further information. Or I guess it's more like an endpoint after you get the result, and then you go figure out yourself. Like you said, there weren't even any support groups before. So clients had to go themselves and figure out where to get the help from. So maybe that's one thing which is stopping that extra bit of information to come in the consent form. And it's more of like added responsibility and work for companies if it's added. But I totally see that from a client's point of view, it might be a good thing to add, because it just adds more quality to the entire statement, that you can expect unanticipated results. But if that happens, do contact us so that we can direct you to maybe the right person or to the right support and help. Yeah. Interesting. I was thinking that I'm going to end up having a lot of questions, but I think the way you've really explained everything for these questions that I've asked has given a very nice overview about NPE, about your field of genetic testing. And I'm sure that maybe listeners might end up having a few questions after the interview. Would you be okay for me to let them know about your social media platform, or to contact you in case if they have any questions?
Yes, please do. I've recently found out some newer resources that are available for people like yourself that are exploring genetic counseling.
Yeah.
And I'm halfway through a draft of a blog post. So when it's finished, I will let you know, and then you can also add that to the show notes. Just try to have everything in one place for people that are starting down this path.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and that's good to know. Definitely, once you're ready with it, I will let everyone in my social media account know about it. I will put it on my blog as well as a link, so that anyone who's interested can go to it and access it. But that's going to be so helpful. Again, like I said, we need more genetic counselors like you who are ready to give their time and share their information with us, because every bit of small information makes a lot of difference to us who are wanting to get into the field. And I think we are very anxious about the fact that we have to get selected in a grad school. So any bit of such information does make a lot of difference. So thank you once again for your time. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Disha. It was a great conversation. I'm really glad you're doing what you're doing, and I wish you the best of luck on your individual path, because I know this is something of interest to you. So I wish you only the best in that journey.
Thank you. Do you have any other questions or any other aspects that you think you want to cover, or anything as such?
I think we've done a really thorough job of covering what I feel like I can add to the conversation that maybe other genetic counselors haven't. I guess I want to end with encouragement to those that are going down this path of applying to genetic counseling program. Realize it is a really competitive path to take, and it may get to a point where you have to consider a different path, but there are so many different ways to help where you can be involved in genetics, genetic testing, helping people. This is one of many, many paths. So keep your mind open, be willing to flex and go with the flow and see what life has to bring, because what you've planned for yourself in your mind is not necessarily going to happen with your life, but it could be even better than what you thought your life could be.
Yep, fantastic. That's a very good piece of advice, and it does give us a lot of motivation. Thank you again, Brianne, and yeah, hope to be in touch, and obviously people will come to you if they have any questions. But thank you so much again for your time today.
You're welcome. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.